This is a guest essay written by Daniel Saunders, who writes the newsletter, The Beginning of Wisdom.
A month after the October 7th attacks, political scientist Shani Moore published an article on Mosaic magazine about the Arab-Israeli or Islamic-Israeli conflict. He divided the wars Israel has fought into two categories. The first consists of those that had short-term goals, such as the Suez War of 1956 and the Yom Kippur War of 1973, which were relatively easily resolved with negotiated truces and peace treaties. In the second category are three wars which, although very different in origin and outcome, have a similar form. The Israeli War of Independence, from 1948 to 1949, the Six-Day War, in 1967, and the Second Intifada, from 2000 to 2005. All three began with genocidal rhetoric in the Arab world, speaking excitedly of destroying Israel and killing or expelling its entire Jewish population, with no dissenting voices raising moral qualms or asking what would happen if Israel won. All three ended in a defeat for the Arab parties, leaving the Palestinians in particular worse off. First, by many leaving Israel, by choice or otherwise, then by being ruled by Israel in Gaza and the so-called West Bank, really Judea and Samaria, then by having an increased security apparatus of checkpoints and the security barrier separating them from Israel, alongside the growth of Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria. After each war, the Palestinians declared themselves to be the victims of genocide and to have suffered more than anyone in history. Two patently false claims, having erased the eagerness and optimism with which they started conflict from their memories, the eternally innocent, perfect victims of world history. Shani Moore feared that the current Gaza war, that had just started at the time of her writing, would follow the same pattern. I was a little skeptical. What could be worse for them? And anyway, the world wouldn't allow anything bad to happen to them, even if the Israelis wanted it, which I doubted. Even the war was rapidly reined in, with Israel forced by then U.S. President Joe Biden's administration to essentially resupply Hamas by allowing food, water, and electricity to be allowed into the Gaza Strip, despite knowing full well that Hamas would steal them. I continued to think that this was the case until the last few weeks, following Hamas's obscene carnival around the return of the bodies of the Bibas family, which later turned out not to include the mother, Shiri Bibas. And seeing the response to it online, I thought, possibly the most significant thing that Hamas achieved on October 7th, in the months following, and especially in the last 24 hours, is to convince many Israelis and even many diaspora Jews, typically more dovish, that removing 2 million Palestinians, utterly enmeshed with Hamas, regardless of legal definitions of guilt, from Gaza and depositing them somewhere, anywhere else in the world, is more moral than leaving them where they are to let Hamas repeat the events of the last year and a half every decade or so. Considering this idea was utterly beyond the pale, even on the Israeli moderate right on October 6th, 2023, when floated by extremist Israeli politicians like Itamar Ben-Gvir, this might be seen as a major achievement, if not the one they were hoping for. I didn't go far enough, though. The idea of resettlement was forbidden even in early stages of war, hence my refusal to countenance it when I read Shani Moore's article, and perhaps his refusal to mention the possibility. Even then, it might not have occurred to me had U.S. President Donald Trump, the great disruptor of existing paradigms, not legitimized it. Regardless of whether that's the case, Hamas's actions during their recent hostage release propaganda ceremonies took Israelis and Jews worldwide back to the lows of October 7th, the early weeks of the war, and the recovery of the body of Hersh Goldberg Polin and those with him. After each of these, the national mood has lifted a little with events like the daring rescue of 4 hostages in Gaza, the exploding Hezbollah pagers, the consequent elimination of Hezbollah's leadership, and the killing of Hamas leaders Mohammed Deif and Yahya Sinwar. But each time it cycles down again whenever Hamas attempts to regain the initiative, something they can still do while still holding numerous hostages and with worldwide support. Yes, Britain, the European Union, the United Nations, the U.S. Democratic Party, and most of the world's mainstream media have been and still are, at least de facto, helping Hamas through their concern for ordinary Palestinians in Gaza, something they show in no similar situation, as demonstrated by the UN's immediate cessation of aid to Yemen on the capture of a mere 13 UN aid workers by the Houthis. Only afterwards did I find out that a majority of Israelis approve of President Trump's plan in theory, and a large minority think it practical and worth pursuing. Only 13% of Israelis see the plan as fundamentally immoral, and almost all of these are Arab Israelis. Only 3% of Jews think it immoral, even if they think it impractical. This survey was taken some time before the Biba's family's return in caskets, and I imagine support is even greater now. In other words, most Israeli Jews find the barrier to relocation of the Palestinians to be pragmatic, not moral. A position that was considered far-right just 16 months ago is now mainstream. As I see it, there are three new factors responsible for this vibe shift. First, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needs to eradicate the enemy on Israel's doorstep to somehow try to save his career after being responsible for the disaster of October 7th. And this eradication is failing because of the enmeshment of Gaza's population with Hamas as human shields. It is necessary to remove the civilians completely to destroy Hamas. Moreover, Hamas is continually replenishing itself from Gaza's population, and arguably only removing the population of Gaza will end the threat to Israel. The second factor is that President Trump is willing to tear up existing ways of doing things and is more than happy to demolish woke dogma. Finally, the events of the last year and a half have brought Israeli Jews, and maybe Jews generally, to a situation where they no longer care about the Palestinians and the mythical two-state solution, quite rightly in my opinion, even if they want to obey international law. It is the latter that brings the most cogent argument against relocation. The Geneva Convention of 1949 states that the population of an occupied area may not be transferred except in cases where, quote, the security of the population or imperative military reasons so demand. In that case, it is permitted to move inhabitants outside the area entirely if there is no alternative for, quote, material reasons. This obviously has a lot of room for interpretation. The Israeli government and the Trump administration could advocate an expansive reading of Gaza as a real and present danger to Israel, while the world would object. It would then become a game of politics, as with the settlements, which suffer from similar legal ambiguity. The question would be whether the support of the U.S. would outweigh the opposition of the rest of the world. It might. Regardless of whether it is illegal, such a transfer will certainly be denounced as immoral, especially for Jews, with their history of displacement. However, this is emotionalism. If Jewish history determined Jewish actions, and Jews should not do to others what was done to them, then Jews should be total pacifists, not engaging in war at all, because many Jews have been killed. The reality is that most Jews distinguish between self-defense and aggression in killing. They can do so in population transfer too. In any case, if Jews forcibly transferred thousands of Jews out of Gaza in pursuit of peace in 2007, it's hard to see how a similar scheme with relocation and compensation could not be justified on similar grounds. What if we take the quasi-Kantian view that not removing people from their homes should be a universal rule, something never to be allowed? But this is nonsense too. Even liberal, democratic Western governments have power of compulsory purchase, sometimes known as eminent domain, of private property in order to build roads and other public goods, even a football stadium in one British case. This encourages us to take a consequentialist viewpoint, whereby the saving of Israeli and Palestinian lives by preventing conflict outweighs the loss of property. In any case, Palestinians in Gaza can hardly claim the Strip as their so-called historic homeland, while simultaneously claiming to be refugees. The consequentialist approach has the advantage of being a historically approved method of preventing conflict. In the aftermath of World War II, millions of ethnic Germans, not Nazis, but people of German origin who happen to have lived in countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia for hundreds of years, were forcibly moved by the Allies into Germany proper to prevent them being used again as the pretext for future wars. Similarly, the partition of India in 1947 saw millions more people displaced, Hindus and Sikhs, from what became Pakistan into India, and Muslims in the opposite direction. Nor were these examples historically unique. The decline of empires into nation-states in the 19th and 20th centuries were often accompanied by significant population transfer to ensure ethnic homogeneity. Forced transfer without compensation is ethnic cleansing, and I and many others would struggle to agree to it, however compelling the arguments. But voluntary transfer with compensation, a one-off payment to start a new life, accompanying a written renunciation of refugee status, and any putative right of return to Israel or so-called Palestine, as well as removal from the role of refugees of UNRWA, the UN agency for so-called Palestinian refugees, would be morally different, particularly if it prevents war. The big questions are practical ones, like where will Palestinians in Gaza go? The Arab states don't want them, both because they want to use them as a weapon against Israel, and because Palestinian communities have a habit of destabilizing other Arab nations from Jordan, whence the government violently expelled them to prevent a coup and civil war, to Lebanon, where they disrupted the delicate religious/ethnic balance and triggered a civil war, to Kuwait, whence they were expelled after supporting the Iraqi invasion. The two most pro-Western Arab states, Egypt and Jordan, won't accept them, since Hamas's parent body, the Muslim Brotherhood, is outlawed in both states, as it aims to overthrow the somewhat moderate, somewhat secular pro-Western governments of these countries and impose an Islamist theocracy. While there are probably enough useful idiots in the Western middle class who would advocate for immigration of Palestinians in Gaza to the West, this would destabilize countries that are already rightly suspicious of Islamist infiltration through immigration, and would likely lead to widespread popular protest. The very popularity of Hamas in Gaza, which makes relocation so urgent, also makes it a non-starter, because of the fear that anyone accepting Palestinians in Gaza would just be importing extremists and terrorists. I doubt that the thought of leaving millions of Palestinians in Gaza in limbo, however justified it might be by their support for Hamas, is something Israel and the US would be able to face doing in practice, however much they talk about it, even aside from the unpredictability of President Trump. A similar problem is the question of how many Palestinians in Gaza would renounce their so-called Palestinian refugee status and move elsewhere. Even extremely settled, westernized Palestinians like billionaire Mohammed Hadid and his supermodel daughters Bella and Gigi, and the late academic Edward Said, insist on their Palestinian refugee status for political reasons, and perhaps also for identity prestige in left-wing elite circles, despite their success and acculturation in the West. So, what chance is there of ordinary Palestinians renouncing their status? Islam and honor-based Islamic anti-Semitism are the primary cause of irrational loyalty to the Palestinian cause. The refusal to accept quote-unquote infidel and especially lowly Jewish sovereignty on a patch of so-called holy Islamic soil conquered by the heirs of Muhammad. However small and insignificant the land in question is, in comparison to Islamic territories elsewhere. UNRWA is merely the mechanism through which this irredentism manifests itself, not the cause of the problem. This issue may be impossible to resolve by external actors. It is hard to be sure of the view of Palestinians in Gaza, given that Hamas still exerts a dictatorial hold over them. But as of June 2024, support for the attack on Israel remained high, although falling slightly, according to the Palestine Center for Policy and Survey Research. There is clear support for Hamas, which indicates there may be support for staying in Gaza as human shields and so-called righteous victims for propaganda in future rounds of fighting. The more dedicated to Hamas that Palestinians in Gaza are, the less likely they are to want to leave and start a new life elsewhere. All that said, and although it is hard to be sure of anything in Gaza, some Palestinians in Gaza certainly wanted to leave the Strip and go to Egypt when the war started. But they were stopped by Hamas and also by the Egyptian government. They may have intended to return later, of course. Ironically, a fully funded resettlement of Gazans could be the best possible outcome for them. Bearing in mind that, given the situation, there is no completely good outcome. Resettlement is what would have happened if they had been a normal refugee population, under the aegis of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN's main refugee body, rather than under UNRWA, its specialist Palestinian refugee body, captured by Palestinian nationalists and their supporters. If even 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza left and were resettled elsewhere in the Middle East and set up independently and built lives and homes, then that might finally provide an alternative to fighting for them, a place where they can live and build lives away from the conflict with a new identity. But this too seems unlikely to work in practice. As noted above, Palestinian refugee status, even among those born generations, after the displacement of the 1948 Israeli War of Independence, combines both national and religious identity elements that Palestinians are unwilling to surrender. The very thought of accepting a Jewish state on so-called holy Islamic soil is seen as utterly dishonorable, not just in Gaza, but across the Middle East, a region where honor is fundamental to life in a way that Westerners, including Israelis, cannot really understand. It is certainly something for which to sacrifice peace, prosperity, and life, including the lives of children, rather than abandon it. Any attempt to remove Palestinians in Gaza by force would probably just reignite the war, with few Palestinians in Gaza cooperating, even if threatened, and Hamas fighting to stop them being moved. My biggest fear from an attempt to move Palestinians in Gaza by force is a Jewish schism. If a forcible relocation took place, the Jewish community would likely split with left against right, Israel against much of the diaspora. I have already seen this dynamic online. I no longer care enough about the Palestinians to worry very much about what happens to them, as long as they aren't cold-bloodedly murdered. But I do not want the already evaporating Jewish unity of the weeks following the October 7th attacks to be destroyed completely. You may sense an equivocation in this article, a sense of being caught between an ethic of justice that demands punishment to avoid repeated offenses and an ethic of compassion that fears that harming others, even when necessary for peace, really just harms the self. A desire to punish the wicked short-circuited by the knowledge that the wicked will see that the bulk of the suffering falls on children. Both ethics are a part of Jewish thought and identity at a fundamental level, hence the logical impasse. I think that a voluntary relocation would be ideal, but I can't see it happening. A legal and even perhaps a moral case can be made for forcible relocation, but it is hard to see how it would work in practice. At the same time, I feel that something like this is going to happen. Not necessarily relocation, but a dramatic new move by Netanyahu and Trump, signaling the final end of the mythical two-state solution, something imposed on Palestinians in Gaza by Israel and the Trump administration to try to prevent October 7th from happening again. There is an urgent need to make Palestinians suffer for what they did on October 7th, not out of revenge, but to show them that the dream of a Palestinian state, and especially the dream of the destruction of Israel, is over. Palestinian nationalism, also known as Palestinianism, a doctrine of hatred for Israel and the desire to destroy it, is a weapon that was invented by the Mufti of Jerusalem a century ago, sharpened for decades by the Arab League, honed to a fine point by the KGB, and is now wielded by the Iranian Ayatollahs as part of their bid for regional and eventually global dominance. So far, no one has been able to make it safe. This has to change. Former Israeli politician Einat Wilf, who coined the term Palestinianism, argues that the world has always bailed out the Palestinians and insulated them from the consequences of their violent actions. They have been allowed to hold on to their Jew hate and rape and murder as a result of it, while Israelis bear the costs. General William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the leading Union generals in the American Civil War, stated, quote, "A people who will persevere in war beyond a certain limit ought to know the consequences." This must happen to the Palestinians. Bear in mind that death is not a deterrent to Islamists. They believe that if they die killing Jews, or even as shields to help others kill Jews, they go to eternal bliss. Only losing more land is a price to them. They need to learn that if they make war on Israel, they will lose badly, and there will be irreversible consequences for them and their families. This may not happen as a result of this war, but sooner or later it will happen, as Israel grows more determined to create a permanent deterrent to escalating violence, and the ethic of justice comes to outweigh the ethic of compassion. I only hope that, however this happens, it does not divide the Jewish people or sully our morality.